On a quiet night in a hospital, something would change the city. A golden retriever silently entered through the automatic doors. Without anyone noticing, he headed towards the ICU. Finding a child, he did something that gave everyone goosebumps. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The fluorescent lights of St. Clair's Hospital flickered softly in the silent third-floor corridor. It was a night like any other for nurse Hannah Sanders, who was completing her 12th consecutive shift in the neonatal ICU. Her footsteps echoed on the vinyl floor as she checked the charts of the little patients until an unusual movement caught her attention. A golden retriever with shiny golden fur walked purposefully down the corridor as if he knew his destination perfectly. Hannah rubbed her eyes, thinking that fatigue was playing tricks on her mind. But no, the dog was real and was heading determinedly towards the neonatal ICU. "How did you get in here?" Hannah whispered, watching the animal approach the crib where Michael, a premature baby, had been bravely fighting for weeks. The dog ignored the question and, with surprising gentleness, lay down beside the crib. Hannah knew she should immediately expel the animal. Hospital rules were clear about this. However, something stopped her. Perhaps it was the dog's deep and serene gaze, or the way he seemed to understand exactly what he was doing. As she observed the unusual scene, Hannah noticed something extraordinary. Michael's heart monitors, which until then had shown irregular patterns, began to show more stable signs. The oxygen saturation, which had always been a concern, showed significant improvement. "This is impossible," she muttered to herself, repeatedly checking the devices. But the numbers didn't lie. The dog's presence seemed to have an inexplicable effect on the baby. In the following hours, Hannah remained vigilant, torn between her professional duty to follow the rules and the intuition that told her to allow that mysterious connection to continue. The golden remained motionless, only slightly moving his head when a device emitted a different sound. Dr. Richard, the pediatrician on duty, entered the ICU for his night rounds and stopped abruptly upon seeing the dog. "Hannah, what's this about?" "Doctor, I know it seems crazy, but look at the monitors. Since he arrived, Michael's vital signs have improved considerably," Hannah explained, showing the records of the latest parameters. The doctor adjusted his glasses, carefully analyzing the data. His initial expression of disapproval was gradually replaced by one of intrigued curiosity. "This is remarkable," he admitted, albeit with evident skepticism. As the night progressed, other members of the medical team began to notice the presence of the unusual visitor. Some protested vehemently, citing hygiene and safety protocols. Others, impressed by the improvement in Michael's vital signs, defended the animal's stay. Hannah observed everything with a mixture of apprehension and hope. In her 15 years of nursing, she had never witnessed anything like it. The golden retriever seemed to emanate an aura of serenity that not only affected Michael, but the entire ICU environment. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Hannah realized she was witnessing something that went beyond scientific understanding. This dog was not a simple animal. It was a messenger, a guardian who had arrived at the exact moment when Michael needed him most. The nurse knew that with the start of the new day, she would face questions and possible reprimands for her decision to allow the dog to stay. But something in her heart told her that this extraordinary night was just the beginning of an even more surprising story. As she prepared the shift report, Hannah cast a last glance at the golden, who maintained his silent vigil. Their eyes met briefly, and she could swear she saw a glimmer of ancient wisdom in that canine gaze. What else did this mysterious guardian have in store for them? Only time would tell. The news about the mysterious dog in the neonatal ICU spread quickly through St. Clair's Hospital. The next morning, Dr. Beatrice Mitchell, the administrative director, called an emergency meeting. Hannah felt her stomach churn when she received the summons, but remained firm in her conviction. "It's completely unacceptable," Dr. Beatrice railed, gesturing emphatically. "A dog in a neonatal ICU? Have you completely lost your minds?" Her high heels echoed through the meeting room as she paced back and forth. Dr. Richard, who had witnessed the transformation the night before, cleared his throat before intervening. "Dr. Mitchell, I know it seems absurd, but the data doesn't lie. Baby Michael has shown significant improvement in the last 12 hours, more than we've achieved in 3 weeks of intensive treatment." Hannah seized the opportunity to present the graphs she had prepared, showing the evolution of Michael's vital signs. Oxygen levels have risen by 30%, heart rate has stabilized, and for the first time since his admission, we've been able to reduce ventilatory support. The administrative director frowned, studying the numbers carefully. For a moment, her severe countenance softened slightly. "Even if there is some correlation," she carefully chose her words, "we can't simply ignore all safety and hygiene protocols." It was then that Dr. Marina Alvarez, the hospital's infectologist who had remained silent until then, spoke up. "Actually, I did some research during the night. There are preliminary studies on the presence of animals in hospital environments. St. Mary's Hospital in London has a pilot program with therapy dogs in the pediatric ward, with promising results." The murmur in the room increased. Hannah perceived a small breach in the initial resistance and continued, "The most intriguing thing is that this dog seems to have extraordinarily conscious behavior. He maintains impeccable hygiene, a bark doesn't move abruptly. It's as if he knew exactly what he's doing," Dr. Richard completed, still intrigued by the events of the previous night. Dr. Beatrice sighed deeply. "I'll give you 48 hours, she finally declared. "If there's any, and I mean any sign of complication or deterioration in the patient's condition, the animal will be immediately removed. And you," she pointed to Hannah and Dr. Richard, "will be personally responsible for any consequences." As the meeting dispersed, Hannah received an urgent message from her colleague Julia, who was covering her shift in the ICU. "You need to see this. The dog is doing something incredible." Hannah ran through the corridors, her heart racing. Upon arriving at the ICU, she found a surprising scene. The golden retriever was standing, his front paws gently resting on the edge of Michael's crib. His eyes were fixed on the baby, and he was emitting a soft sound, almost like a murmur. "He started doing this a few minutes ago," Julia explained, amazed. "And look at the monitors." The devices showed a perfect synchronization between the baby's breathing and the rhythm of the sound emitted by the dog. It was as if he was guiding Michael in a natural breathing exercise. "But who are you?" Hannah whispered, approaching the animal. For the first time, she noticed something that had gone unnoticed in the agitation of the previous night. A small golden medal hung from the dog's neck, partially hidden by his fur. Carefully, Hannah brushed aside the fur to read the inscription. Her heart almost stopped when she read the engraved words, "Gabriel, Four-Pawed Angels Project, St. Mary's Hospital, London." The discovery opened up a new world of possibilities and questions. How had a dog trained in London arrived here? Why did he choose Michael? And, more importantly, what was the true scope of this mysterious connection between the animal and the baby? Hannah knew that the next 48 hours would be crucial, not only to prove the therapeutic value of Gabriel's presence, but also to unravel the mystery surrounding his providential appearance. Meanwhile, in the crib, Michael slept serenely, his small hand extended towards his golden guardian's muzzle. Determined to discover more about Gabriel, Hannah took advantage of her lunch break to research the Four-Pawed Angels project. Her findings left her even more intrigued. The program had been started 5 years ago at St. Mary's Hospital in London, with dogs specially trained to assist critically ill patients. However, according to official records, only 12 dogs were part of the project, and all were actively working in England. "How did you end up here, Gabriel?" Hannah murmured, observing the golden retriever who maintained his tireless vigil beside Michael. The dog turned his head slightly in her direction, his amber eyes shining with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. At that moment, an elderly lady entered the ICU, leaning on a cane. It was Mrs. Clara, Michael's grandmother, who had been visiting him every day since his admission. Upon seeing Gabriel, she dropped her cane, her hands visibly trembling. "It can't be," she whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Gabriel!" Hannah quickly approached to help her. "Do you know this dog, ma'am?" Mrs. Clara nodded, still in shock. "He belonged to my son, Thomas. He was his inseparable companion when... They lived in London. Her voice faltered. Thomas worked as a veterinarian at St. Mary's Hospital, helped train the first dogs in the project. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Hannah led Mrs. Clara to a chair, eager to hear more. The story that followed was as extraordinary as Gabriel's very presence in the ICU. Thomas had been one of the pioneers in the Four-Pawed Angels project, and Gabriel was his first trained dog. Together they developed revolutionary techniques in animal-assisted therapy. However, after an accident that left him unable to continue his work, Thomas had to return to the United States for treatment. Gabriel stayed in London, continuing his work at the hospital. "But that was 3 years ago," Mrs. Clara explained, her voice choked. He never fully recovered. When he found out he was going to be a grandfather, it was as if a new light appeared in his life. He was so eager to meet Michael. Hannah felt her heart tighten. "Mrs. Clara, where is your son now?" "He's at home, Hannah. The doctor recommended absolute rest after a recent complication. He couldn't even come to meet his grandson." At that instant, Gabriel stood up and approached Mrs. Clara, gently resting his head on her lap. The gesture was so gentle, so full of meaning, that both women remained silent for a few moments. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Clara murmured, stroking Gabriel's golden fur. "Somehow, he found a way to be here, to take care of Thomas's grandson." The afternoon advanced, and with it came more surprises. Dr. Richard entered the ICU carrying a laptop. "Hannah, you need to see this," he called, excited. "I managed to contact the team at St. Mary's Hospital." On the screen, a video conference revealed the concerned face of Dr. Elizabeth Thompson, coordinator of the Four-Pawed Angels project. "It's extraordinary," she commented after hearing the report about Gabriel. "Our Gabriel disappeared 3 days ago, causing great concern. No one could understand how he had escaped from such a secure area." "But how did he manage to get to the United States?" Hannah questioned. Dr. Elizabeth shook her head. "That's the most incredible part. We have no idea. It's as if he simply knew he needed to be there." As the conversation continued, Gabriel kept his eyes fixed on Michael, who was sleeping peacefully. The monitors showed increasingly stable vital signs, and for the first time since his admission, the baby began to gain weight consistently. Hannah observed everything with a mixture of admiration and perplexity. Gabriel's story was even more extraordinary than she had initially imagined. He wasn't just a therapy dog that had mysteriously appeared. He was a guardian who had crossed oceans to fulfill a very special mission. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange through the ICU windows. The 48 hours granted by Dr. Mitchell were halfway through, but now Hannah had much more than numbers and graphs to defend Gabriel's stay. She had a story of deep connections, unbreakable bonds, and a love that transcended distances and rational explanations. The news about Gabriel's true identity and his connection to Michael's family spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses, doctors, and even patients from other floors found excuses to pass by the neonatal ICU, hoping to glimpse the dog who had crossed an ocean on his own. Hannah took advantage of her day off to visit Thomas, Michael's father. Driving to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, she found a modest house with a well-tended small garden. Mrs. Clara received her at the door, her face tired but hopeful. "Thomas is on the back porch," the lady explained. "Since I told him about Gabriel, he's been different, more alive." Hannah crossed the house and found Thomas sitting in a wheelchair, observing the garden. Despite his physical condition, his blue eyes shone with an intensity that reminded her of Gabriel's. "So you're the nurse who allowed my old friend to stay with Michael," he said, turning to face her. His voice was soft but firm. "There aren't enough words to thank you. Mr. Thomas, actually, I came because I need to understand better. How is it possible that Gabriel made it here?" Thomas smiled, a smile that mixed nostalgia and admiration. Gabriel was always special, even among the project dogs. He had a unique ability to sense when someone needed him. Not just the assigned patients, but anyone in distress. As he spoke, Thomas showed Hannah a photo album, images of Gabriel as a puppy, his training at the hospital, special moments with patients he had helped. We developed a different method of therapy together. It wasn't just about presence or physical comfort. Gabriel could establish a kind of energetic connection with the patients. How so? Hannah asked, intrigued. We noticed that he synchronized his breathing with patients in respiratory distress, exactly as he's doing with Michael. But more than that, he seemed capable of transmitting a vital force, a healing energy that science still can't explain. At that moment, Hannah's cell phone rang. It was Julia, her colleague from the ICU. "Hannah, you need to come back to the hospital. Something incredible is happening." Thomas perceived the urgency in her voice. "Go," he said, "and please tell Gabriel I'm proud of him." Upon arriving at the hospital, Hannah found a small crowd gathered in front of the neonatal ICU. Dr. Richard was beaming. Michael started breathing on his own, he announced. "We managed to remove the ventilatory support completely." Through the glass, Hannah saw Gabriel lying next to the crib, his eyes fixed on Michael. The baby, for the first time since his premature birth, was breathing independently and regularly. Dr. Mitchell, who was analyzing the new exams, seemed disconcerted. "In 30 years of medicine, I've never seen such a rapid and significant recovery," she admitted. Maybe we'll have to reconsider some of our protocols." While everyone celebrated Michael's improvement, Hannah noticed something different about Gabriel. The dog seemed more tired, as if the effort of helping the baby was consuming his own strength. "He's giving too much of himself," she murmured, remembering Thomas's words about healing energy. That night, after her shift, Hannah remained in the ICU, observing the interaction between Gabriel and Michael. The dog maintained his tireless vigil, occasionally emitting that soft and harmonious sound that seemed to lull the baby. It was then that she noticed something extraordinary. Every time Gabriel produced that sound, small bluish lights seemed to dance in the air between him and Michael. It was so subtle that it could easily be confused with a reflection of the hospital lights, but Hannah knew she was witnessing something much deeper. "You're literally transferring your life force to him, aren't you?" she whispered to Gabriel. The dog turned his head slightly in her direction, his eyes revealing an ancient and profound wisdom. The night advanced, and with it grew the certainty that the bond between Gabriel and Michael went far beyond human understanding. It was a connection that transcended logic and science, an invisible tie woven with threads of love, hope, and a magic that few could understand. The next morning, Hannah noticed a subtle but worrying change in Gabriel. His fur, once shimmering like liquid gold, was beginning to lose its luster. His movements, always graceful and precise, seemed slower and more calculated, as if each gesture required a conscious effort. "You need to rest a bit," she whispered, stroking the dog's head. Gabriel just looked at her with those deep eyes and turned his attention back to Michael, who now breathed peacefully in his crib. Dr. Marina entered the ICU carrying a series of equipment. "Hannah, I got authorization to do some measurements. I want to better understand what's happening here." Over the next few hours, they conducted a series of non-invasive tests, measuring electromagnetic fields, temperature, and other parameters around Gabriel and Michael. The results were surprising. "It's incredible," Marina murmured, analyzing the data on her tablet. "There's a measurable energy field between them. When Gabriel emits that sound, the frequency of Michael's brain waves synchronizes perfectly with his. But at what cost?" Hannah questioned, observing how Gabriel seemed increasingly exhausted after each therapy session. That afternoon, Thomas finally managed to visit the hospital. Even in his wheelchair, he insisted on going to the ICU to see his son and reunite with his old companion. When Gabriel saw Thomas, his tail began to wag slightly, but he didn't abandon his position beside Michael. "My old friend," Thomas said with tears in his eyes. "You always knew what needed to be done, didn't you?" Approaching the crib, he saw his son for the first time. "He's so small. But he's getting stronger every day," Helena added. "Thanks to Gabriel." Thomas carefully observed his old partner. "He's sacrificing himself," he noted with concern. "He's channeling his own life force to Michael." What do you mean? Helena asked, alarmed. During our research in London, we discovered that some dogs in the project had an extraordinary ability to transfer vital energy to critically ill patients. But Gabriel, he was different. He didn't just share his energy, he gave it completely. At that moment, Michael's monitors began to beep. His heart rate was dangerously accelerating. Before anyone could react, Gabriel stood up, positioned himself closer to the crib, and began to emit that harmonious sound. The phenomenon of the blue lights became more intense than ever. It was as if small stars were dancing between the dog and the baby. Michael's heartbeats began to normalize, but Gabriel visibly trembled with the effort. "He can't continue like this," Thomas said, his voice choked. "He's completely exhausting himself." Helena realized they were facing an impossible dilemma. Gabriel was saving Michael, but at the cost of his own vitality. The dog that had crossed an ocean to save his old companions, grandson was willing to give his all, literally, to complete his mission. "There must be another way," Helena insisted, refusing to accept that they would have to choose between Michael's life and Gabriel's well-being. It was then that Mrs. Anderson, who had been observing everything in silence, stepped forward. "Maybe I can help," she said, taking an old book with a worn cover from her bag. "This book belonged to my grandmother, a healer from the countryside. She always said there are ways to channel and amplify vital energy without exhausting its source." As the sun set on the horizon, casting golden shadows through the NICU windows, Helena, Thomas, and Mrs. Anderson gathered around the ancient book, desperately seeking a solution that could save both Michael and his tireless guardian. Mrs. Anderson's old book turned out to be a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge. Its yellowed pages contained not only recipes for medicinal herbs, but also detailed instructions on healing rituals and vital energy transfer. "My grandmother called this the Circle of Light," Mrs. Anderson explained, her wrinkled fingers gently caressing the pages of the book. "It's a ritual that allows several people to share their vital energy with those who need it, without anyone becoming completely exhausted." Helena studied the illustrations in the book carefully. Meticulous drawings showed people arranged in a circle, with specific symbols and crystals positioned at strategic points. "But how can we be sure this will work?" "We can't," Thomas replied, leaning forward in his wheelchair to examine the book more closely. "But we also can't let Gabriel continue sacrificing himself like this." Dr. Sarah, who had remained silent until then, spoke up. "From a scientific point of view, we've already proven the existence of energy fields between Gabriel and Michael. If there's a way to amplify and distribute this energy, we need to try," Helena decided, observing how Gabriel seemed increasingly debilitated. His fur, once golden and shiny, was now dull and lifeless. Even so, he maintained his tireless vigil beside Michael. In the hours that followed, they prepared everything according to the book's instructions. Dr. Thompson, surprisingly, authorized the procedure after seeing the alarming results of Gabriel's latest tests. "I never thought I'd say this," she commented, "but we've witnessed so many miracles in the last few days that I'm willing to try anything that might help." As evening fell, when the NICU was quieter, they began the ritual. Rose quartz crystals were positioned in a circle around Michael's crib. Gabriel, instinctively understanding his role, lay down in the center of the circle, close to the baby. Mrs. Anderson, Thomas, Helena, Dr. Sarah, and even Dr. Thompson formed a larger circle around them. Following the book's instructions, they all held hands, closing their eyes and concentrating on sharing their energy. Mrs. Anderson began to softly chant an old lullaby that her grandmother had taught her. The melody, simple and profound, filled the environment with a peculiar vibration. Gabriel, recognizing the moment, began to emit his harmonious sound, perfectly synchronized with the chant. It was then that something extraordinary happened. The blue lights that previously appeared only between Gabriel and Michael began to manifest throughout the circle. It was as if thousands of tiny stars were dancing in the air, connecting everyone present in a luminous web of energy. Helena felt a gentle tingling course through her body, as if a very delicate electric current was flowing through her. She could feel the same energy emanating from everyone in the circle, converging to the center where Gabriel and Michael were. Michael's heart monitors began to register even more stable patterns than before. But the most surprising thing was Gabriel. For the first time in days, the dog seemed to truly relax, as if the weight of carrying that responsibility alone was finally being shared. The ritual continued for almost an hour, Mrs. Anderson's chant, blending with Gabriel's harmonious sound and the rhythmic beep of the monitors in a unique and powerful symphony. When they finally finished, everyone was exhausted, but it was a different kind of tiredness, like after an invigorating exercise. "Look!" exclaimed Helena, pointing to Gabriel. The dog's fur had regained some of its golden shine, and his eyes were more alive and alert. At the same time, Michael slept peacefully, his vital signs stronger than ever. Dr. Thompson, always skeptical, carefully examined the monitor data. "This is extraordinary," she admitted. "Michael's brainwave patterns are perfectly balanced, and his oxygenation is better than ever." Thomas approached Gabriel, stroking his now brighter fur. "You don't need to do this alone anymore, my friend," he whispered. "Now we can all help." In the days that followed the Circle of Light ritual, a remarkable transformation occurred in the NICU. The environment, once charged with tension and concern, now emanated a serene and welcoming energy. Every night, the group gathered to repeat the ritual, each time with more surprising results. Gabriel, gradually recovering his vitality, maintained his position beside Michael, but now with renewed energy. His fur returned to shine with that characteristic golden tone, and his eyes regained the intense brightness of before. Most importantly, he was no longer exhausting himself to help Michael. "It's as if we've created a perfect cycle of energy," Dr. Sarah explained, analyzing the data collected during the rituals. "The energy is no longer flowing just in one direction, from Gabriel to Michael, but circulating among all of us, constantly renewing itself." On a particularly sunny morning, something extraordinary happened. Helena was doing her usual rounds when she noticed a different movement in Michael's crib. The baby, who until then had remained in a deep sleep most of the time, opened his eyes for the first time. "Dr. Johnson," Helena called, her voice trembling with emotion. "Come see this." The doctor quickly approached the crib, marveling at what he saw. Michael's eyes, a deep blue like his father's, observed the environment with surprising curiosity for a premature baby. Gabriel, who was lying in his usual post, immediately stood up. With impressive gentleness, he approached his muzzle to the crib. Michael turned his head towards the dog, and for a magical moment their gazes met. "It's impossible," Dr. Johnson murmured, checking the monitors. "His brain activity is completely normal. It's as if he never had any complications." The news of Michael's awakening spread quickly through the hospital. Thomas, upon being informed, insisted on immediately going to the NICU, even though it was difficult for him to move. When he arrived, accompanied by Mrs. Anderson, tears were flowing freely down his face. "My son," he whispered, bringing his wheelchair closer to the crib. Michael turned towards his father's voice, his small fingers moving as if trying to reach him. Gabriel, observing the scene, emitted a soft sound, different from all the others he had made until then. It was almost a celebratory song. The blue lights appeared again, but this time they were brighter and danced joyfully through the air. Dr. Thompson, who had entered the NICU for her daily inspection, stopped abruptly upon witnessing the scene. "In 30 years of medicine," she said, her voice choked, "I've never seen anything like it. This goes far beyond the science we know." Mrs. Anderson smiled, holding her grandmother's old book close to her chest. "Sometimes, my dear, we need to accept that there are mysteries in the world that science still can't explain. Love, devotion, the connection between beings. All of this is part of a much older and deeper wisdom." That afternoon, when they performed the Circle of Light ritual, something different happened. The blue lights that danced between them seemed more intense, more alive. Michael, now awake, watched the spectacle with fascination, his small eyes following the lights that danced in the air. Gabriel, at the center of the circle, emanated an aura of accomplishment and peace. His mission was almost complete. Michael had not only survived, he was thriving, growing stronger every day. Helena, observing all of this, felt a deep gratitude. She had been a witness and part of something truly extraordinary, something that would forever change her way of seeing the world and medicine. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest miracles happen when we open our hearts to possibilities that go beyond our understanding. 3 weeks after Michael's awakening, the NICU at St. Mary's Hospital was unrecognizable. The walls, once austere and cold, now displayed colorful drawings of dogs and stars made by staff members inspired by Gabriel's story. The environment itself seemed lighter, as if the healing energy that had saved Michael still reverberated through the space. It was a special morning, the day Michael would finally be discharged. His tests showed impressive development, surpassing all medical expectations. Dr. Johnson had declared it was the most extraordinary case of recovery he had ever witnessed in his career. It's as if he was never premature, the doctor explained to the assembled team. His lungs are perfectly developed, his neurological system is responding above average for his age, and his growth is completely normalized. Helena was organizing the final preparations for the discharge when she noticed something different about Gabriel. The dog was sitting near the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he knew his mission was coming to an end. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. "You knew exactly how long you needed to stay here." Gabriel turned to her, his amber eyes shining with that ancient wisdom that Helena had learned to recognize. At that moment, Dr. Elizabeth Parker, the coordinator of the Four-Pawed Angels project, entered. The NICU, having traveled specially from New York for this day. "So it's true," Elizabeth said, moved to see Gabriel. "Our golden boy really crossed an ocean to save a life." Thomas, who was helping Mrs. Anderson with the final preparations to take Michael home, approached his former colleague. "He was always special, Elizabeth, but I don't think any of us imagined how much." The news of Michael's discharge had spread throughout the hospital, and a small crowd gathered to witness the moment. Nurses, doctors, patients, and their families, everyone wanted to say goodbye to the miracle baby and his golden guardian. Dr. Thompson, who had initially been so skeptical, made a surprising decision. "From today on," she announced, "St. Mary's Hospital will have its own animal-assisted therapy program, the Gabriel Project, in honor of our special visitor." The surprise and joy were general. Elizabeth immediately offered to assist in implementing the program, promising to share all the experience from New York Presbyterian Hospital. When the time came for Michael to leave the NICU, something magical happened. The blue lights that had become so familiar in recent weeks appeared one last time, dancing gently around the crib. Gabriel approached, gently touching Michael's hand with his muzzle, and the baby smiled, his first smile. "It's time, isn't it?" Thomas asked, understanding what was about to happen. Gabriel wagged his tail softly, approached each person who had participated in the circle of light rituals, allowing a last caress, a last exchange of glances. Then, with the same dignity and purpose with which he had arrived, Gabriel walked towards the NICU exit. Before leaving, he turned one last time, his eyes meeting Michael's. For a brief moment, the blue lights shone more intensely than ever, like a silent farewell. "Is he going back to New York?" Helena asked Elizabeth. "Yes," she replied, smiling, through tears. "Others need him now, but what he left here, that will remain forever." And it truly did remain. The Gabriel Project became one of the most successful programs at St. Mary's Hospital. In the years that followed, dozens of therapy dogs were trained, bringing comfort and healing to countless patients. Each of them wore a golden medal, similar to Gabriel's, a constant reminder of the guardian who had taught everyone a precious lesson about love, dedication, and the power of connection between beings. Michael grew up strong and healthy, and although he couldn't consciously remember Gabriel, he always showed a special affinity for golden-haired dogs. In his room, a special photograph occupied a prominent place. In it, a golden retriever with extraordinarily wise eyes watched over a small baby in a NICU, while mysterious lights danced in the air around them. The afternoon sun bathed the garden of St. Mary's Hospital, where a golden statue of a golden retriever shone under the light. At its feet, a bronze plaque briefly told the story of Gabriel, the dog who had crossed an ocean to save a life. Michael, now a 10-year-old boy full of energy and curiosity, ran through the garden closely followed by Lucy, a golden retriever from the Gabriel Project. His brown hair waved in the wind as he laughed, playing tag with his canine companion. Helena, now director of the Gabriel Project, watched the scene with a nostalgic smile. A decade had passed since those miraculous days in the NICU, but the magic of that moment remained alive in every corner of the hospital. "It's still hard to believe, isn't it?" said a familiar voice behind her. Thomas, now using a cane instead of a wheelchair, slowly approached. "Sometimes it feels like it was yesterday," Helena replied, hugging her friend. "How's the physical therapy going?" Thomas smiled, taking a few steps without the cane. "Better every day. The doctors say it's a miracle I'm walking again, but we both know miracles happen in this hospital all the time." At that moment, Michael ran up to them, Lucy at his heels. "Aunt Helena, Dad, did you see? Lucy and I were practicing the breathing synchronization you taught us." Helena crouched down to be at eye level with the boy. "And how was it, dear?" "It was amazing," exclaimed Michael, his eyes shining with excitement. "I felt that tingling again, and for a second, I think I saw the blue lights." Thomas and Helena exchanged meaningful looks. Over the years, Michael occasionally mentioned seeing these lights, especially when he was with the project dogs. It was as if a part of that magical connection with Gabriel still lived within him. "Michael," Thomas called softly, "remember that today is a special day. We have a surprise for you." The boy's eyes widened with expectation. "Is it about the story you promised to tell me? About how I was born?" Helena nodded, taking Michael's hand. "Let's go to the NICU. There's someone very special who wants to meet you." They walked through the hospital corridors. Michael watched fascinated at the changes implemented over the years. Each ward now had its own therapy dog, and the walls were decorated with photos of smiling patients alongside their canine companions. When they arrived at the NICU, an elderly lady was waiting for them, her eyes shining with emotion. It was Dr. Elizabeth Parker, who had come specially from New York for this day. "Michael," she said, her voice choked, "it's an honor to finally meet you. I have something very special to show you." Elizabeth opened a folder, revealing a series of old photographs. In one of them, a golden retriever with shiny fur was lying next to a crib, where a tiny baby slept peacefully. "This," she pointed to the dog, "was Gabriel. And this little miracle here is you, Michael." As Elizabeth told the extraordinary story of Gabriel, Michael's eyes filled with tears and wonder. The NICU lights seemed to flicker softly, and for a moment all those present could swear they saw a blue glow dancing in the air. "Gabriel wasn't just a dog," Elizabeth concluded. "He was a guardian, a four-legged angel. And his legacy lives on in you, Michael, and in every life touched by the Gabriel Project." That night, as the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the hospital, Michael sat in the garden, Lucy lying by his side. Closing his eyes, he breathed deeply, feeling a profound connection to something greater than himself. And, in the shadows of twilight, for a brief moment, the statue of Gabriel seemed to come to life, its eyes shining with that ancient wisdom that had changed so many lives. The auditorium of St. Mary's Hospital was packed, a sea of white coats and colorful uniforms. On stage, a 30-year-old man with brown hair and piercing blue eyes adjusted the microphone. Dr. Michael Anderson, now a renowned researcher in integrative medicine, was about to present the results of his revolutionary study. In the front row, Helena, now with grey hair but with the same bright eyes of determination, smiled proudly. Beside her, Thomas, in his wheelchair, held Mrs. Anderson's hand, who at 95 still had that look of someone who guards ancient secrets. "Good afternoon, everyone," Michael began, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "Today I present the results of a decade of research on what we call the Gabriel effect." A murmur of excitement ran through the audience. The Gabriel effect had become legendary in medical circles, although many still considered it more myth than science. 20 years ago, Michael continued, an extraordinary dog named Gabriel crossed an ocean to save the life of a premature baby. That baby was me. Images appeared on the screen behind him, old photographs of the NICU, vital sign graphs, and that iconic image of Gabriel next to the incubator. Since then, the Gabriel project has spread to hospitals around the world. But there has always been one question. How do we scientifically quantify the impact of these therapy dogs? Michael paused dramatically, his eyes scanning the audience. Today I'm pleased to announce that after years of rigorous studies, we've identified what we call the synchronized bioenergetic field. It's a measurable form of energy that manifests when a deep connection occurs between living beings. Complex graphs and resonance images appeared on the screen, showing similar energy patterns between patients and their therapy dogs. But the most incredible thing, Michael continued, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, is that we discovered this field can be amplified and directed through specific techniques. At this moment, Michael made a gesture, and several dogs from the Gabriel project entered the auditorium, each accompanied by a patient. Among them was an elderly golden retriever named Lucy, who had been Michael's companion for 2 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, we'd like to give a demonstration. What followed left the audience in absolute silence. Michael guided those present in a modern version of the ancient circle of light ritual. As people concentrated following his guidance, something extraordinary began to happen. Small points of bluish light began to dance in the air, visible to everyone. The monitors installed on the stage recorded a sudden increase in bioenergetic field activity. What you're seeing, Michael explained, his voice choked with emotion, is the visual manifestation of the synchronized bioenergetic field. It's scientific, proof of the healing power that resides in the deep connection between living beings. The presentation ended with a standing ovation. Scientists, doctors, and nurses, many with tears in their eyes, applauded standing up. The Gabriel effect had finally been validated by science. Later, in the hospital garden, Michael gathered with Helena, Thomas, and Mrs. Anderson. Lucy rested at his feet, her graying muzzle resting on her paws. "You did it, son," said Thomas, hugging Michael. "You transformed a miracle into science." Helena smiled, tears of joy in her eyes. "Gabriel would be so proud. You not only continued his legacy, you expanded it beyond what we could imagine." Mrs. Anderson, holding her old book of wisdom, said softly, "The magic was always there, my dear. You just found a way for everyone to see it." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Michael knelt beside Lucy, stroking her fur. For a moment he could swear he saw the silhouette of another golden retriever, younger and more vibrant, running across the lawn. "Thank you, Gabriel," he whispered, "for everything." And in that magical moment, the blue lights danced one last time, celebrating the perfect union between science and magic, between the visible and the invisible, between the past and the future. The circle was complete. End of story.